There is a strange kind of silence that arrives not after failure, but after everything you were supposed to want finally falls into place. The promotion comes. The relationship stabilizes. The external life looks exactly as you designed it. And yet, something inside has gone completely quiet. Not peaceful. Hollow. Like walking through a house you built yourself and realizing you no longer live there. What if that emptiness isn't a sign that something's wrong with you, but the first honest signal your psyche has sent in years? Part 1. The anatomy of a quiet collapse. There is a particular exhaustion that sleep cannot fix. You felt it. The body rests. The mind quiets. But somewhere deeper, a current of unease continues to flow, untouched by anything external. You might call it burnout. You might call it depression. You might call it simply losing your spark. But these words only describe the surface. They name the symptom without touching the cause. They give you a label to carry, while the emptiness continues its slow, silent work beneath everything. What's actually happening is far more specific and far more hopeful than any of those labels suggest. Here's what I want you to consider. The part of you that has stopped wanting things hasn't stopped wanting at all. It has simply stopped wanting what no longer belongs to you. The goals that once pulled you forward with magnetic force now feel like dead weight, because they were never truly yours to begin with. They were borrowed, inherited, absorbed from the air around you, before you ever had the chance to ask whether they fit the shape of who you actually are. This is the moment most people misunderstand. They feel the silence and panic. They assume something has broken. They reach for anything that might restore the old momentum. New goals, new distractions, new reasons to keep running. But the silence isn't a malfunction. It's a message. And until you learn to read what it's actually saying, you'll exhaust yourself trying to fix something that was never broken. Here's the question that sits at the center of everything we're about to explore. What if the loss of motivation you're experiencing isn't a loss at all, but the first stage of a psychological transformation that few people ever complete, because few people ever understand what's actually happening to them? To answer that question, we have to go somewhere most self-help content never goes. We have to look at what motivation actually is, not as a feeling to be manufactured, but as a psychological structure that follows very specific laws. Laws that, once you understand them, change everything about how you interpret your own emptiness. Part 2. The architecture of borrowed desire. Think about the last time you felt truly pulled towards something. Not obligated. Not expected. Not this would look good on a resume. But genuinely, quietly drawn, the way water moves downhill without being told. Now think about how rare that feeling has become. Most of what we call motivation isn't motivation at all. It's compliance dressed up as desire. It's the internalized voice of a parent asking what you'll do with your life. It's the silent pressure of peers moving forward while you stand still. It's the algorithm showing you what successful people do at 5 a.m. These borrowed reasons to move are not useless. They serve a function. They get you out of bed. They fill the resume. They create the appearance of a life that's going somewhere. But they have a hidden cost that only becomes visible once you've accumulated enough of them. The cost is this. Every time you achieve something driven by borrowed motivation, you strengthen a version of yourself that isn't actually you. You build a life that belongs to someone else, a composite character assembled from expectations, comparisons, and the quiet terror of being left behind. And then one day, something shifts. Maybe it's a minor disruption, a canceled plan, a quiet Sunday with nowhere to be. Or maybe it's something larger, a loss, a health scare. A relationship that ends not with drama but with the slow realization that you were never really present in it. In that space, the noise of borrowed motivation quiets just enough for you to hear something underneath it. Nothing. A vast, terrifying nothing. The silence of not knowing what you actually want, because you've never had to know. The borrowed reasons were always there, ready to fill any gap. And now that they've gone quiet, you're face to face with a question that feels impossible to answer. What would I want if no one was watching? This is not a question the borrowed self can answer. It's not even a question the borrowed self can hear. And so the system that once propelled you forward begins to stall, not because you've lost the ability to move, but because the engine was never actually yours to begin with. Part 3. When the performance ends. There's a particular kind of loneliness that actors describe when the stage lights go dark and the audience disappears. Not the loneliness of being alone, but the loneliness of no longer being seen. Of existing without the gaze that gave your movements meaning. What's unsettling about this loneliness isn't the absence of others. It's the discovery that without their eyes on you, you're not entirely sure who you are. This is not just an actor's experience. It's the experience of anyone who has built their identity around being perceived in a certain way. And if you look closely at your own life, you might find that more of your motivation than you'd like to admit was fueled by this very dynamic. The desire to be seen as competent, as successful, as having it together, as being the kind of person others admire, envy, or approve of. These desires are not shallow. They're human. They're wired into us from the earliest moments of life, when a parent's approving gaze meant safety and belonging. But they have a shelf life. At some point, the gaze that once nourished you begins to feel like a cage. The approval you once craved starts to taste hollow, and the performance that once energized you becomes exhausting, not because you're doing more, but because you're no longer convinced that the character you're playing is worth the effort. This is the moment when the psychological structure known as the persona begins to crack. The persona is not a mask in the simple sense. It's not deception. It's the interface between your inner world and the social world. The version of yourself that can be understood, accepted, and valued by others. Without it, you couldn't function. You couldn't hold a job, maintain relationships, or navigate the countless small negotiations of daily life. But the persona has a weakness. It can become too rigid, too identified with, too much the only version of yourself you recognize. And when that happens, something strange occurs. The persona stops being a tool and becomes a prison. You no longer wear it. It wears you. Have you ever caught yourself performing even when no one is watching? Maintaining a posture, a tone, a way of being that serves no audience but the one you've internalized. That's the persona overgrown. That's the interface becoming the entire operating system. And here's what makes this relevant to the emptiness you might be feeling right now. When awareness begins to expand, whether through deliberate inner work or through circumstances that force you to slow down, the persona loses its grip. You start to see it for what it is. A construction, a useful fiction, a character you've been playing so long you forgot it was a character at all. This is liberation, but it doesn't feel like liberation at first. It feels like loss, because the persona wasn't just how others saw you. It was how you generated the energy to move through the world. Its approval-seeking mechanisms were your fuel. Its performance goals were your direction. And when those mechanisms stop working, when the applause no longer moves you, you're left with a terrifying question. What moves me now? This is where most people turn back. The silence is too loud. The emptiness too vast. They scramble to rebuild the persona, to find new audiences, new performances, new ways to be seen. And the cycle continues. But if you can stay in that silence long enough, if you can resist the urge to fill it with borrowed reasons to move, something else begins to emerge. Something quieter, slower, and far more true. But before that something can emerge, You have to pass through something else first, something most people spend their entire lives avoiding. You have to meet the parts of yourself the persona was built to hide. Part 4. The underworld of the psyche. There is a reason the silence feels heavy beyond simple emptiness. There is a reason the stillness carries a weight that seems to press against you from the inside. You are not just losing motivation, you are being pulled towards something you've spent a lifetime learning to ignore. Every persona is built on a foundation of exclusion. To be seen as competent, you must suppress the parts of you that feel inadequate. To be seen as strong, you must bury the parts of you that feel fragile. To be seen as good, you must exile the parts of you that harbor less acceptable desires, angers, and needs. This exiled material doesn't disappear. It accumulates. It forms a counterpart to the persona, a shadow self that contains everything you've learned to disown. And the more energy you invest in maintaining the persona, the more charged and volatile this shadow becomes. This is not metaphor. This is not poetry. This is a precise description of how the psyche organizes itself when forced to present a partial version of a whole human being. And here's what happens when the persona begins to crack. The shadow stirs. All that exiled material, the anger you never expressed, the needs you never acknowledged, the desires you labeled as selfish or wrong, begins to press against the weakening barrier, not to destroy you, but to be seen, to be integrated, to be allowed back into the whole of who you are. The problem is, this doesn't feel like integration at first. It feels like invasion. You might find yourself suddenly irritable without cause, exhausted without exertion, sensitive to small things that never bothered you before. You might experience waves of sadness that seem to come from nowhere, or flashes of anger disproportionate to any trigger. You might find yourself withdrawing from people and situations that once energized you, craving silence and solitude with an intensity that frightens you. The natural response to these experiences is resistance. You try to push them away. You label them as problems to be solved, symptoms to be managed, weaknesses to be overcome. You reach for anything that might restore the old order, the old motivation, the old momentum, the old sense of being in control. But here's what you need to understand. The shadow does not respond to force. It has been forced into exile for decades. More force only deepens the exile. More resistance only strengthens its need to be acknowledged. The shadow responds to one thing only: recognition. There is a principle in depth psychology that sounds almost too simple to be true, yet holds more practical wisdom than entire libraries of self-help literature. The principle is this: whatever you resist persists. Whatever you acknowledge begins to transform. This is not about embracing your darkness in some dramatic or performative way. It's about something far quieter and more radical. It's about turning toward the parts of yourself you've been taught to turn away from. Not to indulge them, not to act them out, but simply to see them, to let them exist in awareness without immediately trying to fix, change, or eliminate them. The exhaustion you feel right now is not just the absence of motivation. It's the energy cost of maintaining the exile. It's the psychic equivalent of holding a beach ball underwater. You've been doing it so long you've forgotten you're doing it. But the effort is constant. The drain is real. And the only way to stop the drain is to let the ball rise. This is why the emptiness after awakening feels so heavy. It's not empty at all. It's full of everything you've been keeping down. And until you let it surface, until you let it be seen, the energy required to keep it submerged will continue to consume you. But if you can do this, if you can turn toward rather than away, something remarkable begins to happen. The shadow, once seen, stops acting like an enemy. It reveals itself not as a monster, but as a collection of abandoned needs, frozen emotions, and disowned capacities. And as you integrate these exiled parts, a new kind of energy becomes available to you. Not the forced, borrowed energy of persona-driven motivation. something quieter, more stable, more genuinely yours. But before that energy can flow freely, there is a phase you must pass through that looks from the outside like nothing at all. A phase where nothing seems to be happening, a phase that modern life has no patience for and no language to describe. Part 5. The sacred pause. There is a period in the life cycle of certain creatures where all visible activity ceases. The caterpillar, having spun its cocoon, does not simply grow wings. It dissolves. Its entire previous structure breaks down into a kind of organic soup, undifferentiated, unrecognizable, appearing to the outside observer as death. And then, from that formlessness, something entirely new emerges. This is not a metaphor for transformation. This is transformation itself, and it contains a truth that our culture of constant productivity has forgotten. Some things cannot be built until the old things have been completely dissolved. Some new forms require a period of genuine formlessness. You are in this period. The emptiness you feel is not the absence of content. It is the necessary space in which new content can form without being contaminated by the old. The silence is not the absence of voice. It is the condition required for a voice you've never heard before to become audible. But this period is almost impossible to navigate without understanding it, because everything in our world is designed to prevent it. We live in a culture that measures value by output, that treats any pause as a problem to be solved, that equates stillness with stagnation and silence with failure. When you enter this in-between phase, this cocoon state, the external world begins to worry about you. Friends ask what you're doing. Family wonders if you're okay. The voice in your own head starts to echo their concern. Why aren't you moving? What's wrong with you? When will you get back to normal? The pressure to exit this phase prematurely is immense. And many people do. They force themselves back into motion. They grab new goals, new projects, new relationships, anything to fill the silence and restore the appearance of forward movement. They leave the cocoon before the dissolution is complete, and what emerges is not a butterfly, but a patched-together version of the caterpillar, trying to fly with wings that never fully formed. This is why so many transformations fail, not because the person wasn't capable of change, but because they couldn't tolerate the formless phase. They couldn't withstand the pressure to be productive, to have answers, to present a coherent story about who they are and where they're going. But here's what I want you to consider. The formless phase is not a design flaw in the process of transformation. It is the process. The silence is not an obstacle to be overcome. It is the environment in which something genuine can finally emerge. Your inability to generate motivation the old way is not a failure. It is protection. It is your psyche refusing to let you return to borrowed reasons, borrowed directions, borrowed versions of yourself. What if you stopped trying to get your motivation back? What if you allowed yourself to be exactly where you are? Still, uncertain, unproductive, undefined, without rushing to fix it. This is not passivity. It's not resignation. It's the most active form of trust there is. Trust that your psyche knows what it's doing. Trust that the dissolution is not destruction, but preparation. Trust that on the other side of this silence, something is forming that could never have formed while you were still running. And there's something else you need to understand about this phase. Something that explains why it feels not just empty, but strangely compelled. As if you're not choosing to be still, but being stilled by something larger than your conscious will. Part 6. The thermostatic psyche. There is a principle that operates in the psyche as reliably as gravity operates in the physical world. It's not a metaphor. It's not a philosophy. It's an observable pattern that appears whenever a psychological system is pushed too far in one direction. The principle is this: any tendency driven to an extreme will generate its opposite. This is not punishment. It's not karma. in any mystical sense. It's simply the way self-regulating systems maintain balance. Push a pendulum far to the right, and it will swing back with equal force to the left. Run a fever too high, and the body will trigger mechanisms to cool itself. Drive a psyche too long toward control, effort, and constant forward motion, and it will eventually generate an equal and opposite force toward surrender, stillness, and pause. If you've spent years, decades, pushing yourself to achieve, to perform, to become, to prove, to earn your place in the world through constant doing, then the stillness you're experiencing now is not a collapse. It's a correction. It's your psychological immune system finally saying enough and forcing a period of recovery that your conscious mind would never have chosen. Think about the last several years of your life. Not the highlights reel, not the version you present to others. The actual lived texture of your days. How much of your movement was driven by genuine desire rather than obligation? How many of your goals were chosen freely rather than inherited from the expectations around you? How often did you rest without guilt? How often did you do nothing without feeling like you were falling behind? If you're like most people who find themselves in this kind of emptiness, the answers are uncomfortable. You were running on borrowed fuel. You were moving because stopping felt like failure. You were achieving because not achieving felt like disappearing. And now your psyche has pulled the emergency brake. This is not weakness. This is intelligence. This is a system that knows its own limits better than your conscious mind ever could. The stillness you're experiencing is not a problem to be solved. It's a solution your deeper self has imposed on a way of living that had become unsustainable. But here's what makes this phase so difficult. It contradicts everything you've been taught about growth. You were taught that progress means more action, not less. That improvement means faster, not slower. That the answer to feeling stuck is to push harder, not to stop completely. Every productivity system, every self-help framework, every cultural message about success reinforces the same idea. Movement equals value. Stillness equals decay. And so when the psyche forces stillness upon you, you interpret it as failure. You fight it. You try to override it. You reach for caffeine, for new goals, for anything that might restart the engine and get you moving again. But the engine isn't broken. It's being rebuilt. And if you keep trying to run it before the rebuild is complete, you'll only damage it further. This is the hidden wisdom of the phase you're in. The silence is not empty. It's full of reorganization. The stillness is not stagnation. It's the necessary condition for a different kind of movement to emerge, one that won't burn you out, because it's not running on borrowed fuel. But what does that different kind of movement actually feel like? How do you recognize motivation that's genuinely yours, rather than motivation you've absorbed from the world around you? Part 7. The anatomy of authentic movement. There is a difference between being pulled and being pushed. It's subtle, easy to miss if you're not paying attention. But once you learn to feel the difference, you can never unfeel it. Pushed motivation has a particular texture. It's urgent, tense. It carries a sense of or else, an unspoken threat that if you don't move, something bad will happen. You'll fall behind. You'll be judged. You'll disappoint someone. You'll disappoint yourself. This motivation feels like running from something, even when it's dressed up as running toward. Pulled motivation is different. It doesn't shout. It doesn't threaten. It doesn't create anxiety about what happens if you don't respond. It simply invites. It's a quiet gravity that draws you toward something without explaining why. You find yourself interested in something before you can justify the interest. You feel a subtle warmth toward a direction before you can articulate what it offers. This is the difference between borrowed motivation and what could be called essential motivation. Borrowed motivation comes from outside, from expectations, comparisons, fears, shoulds. Essential motivation comes from inside, from something that feels less like a decision and more like a recognition. I didn't choose this. I just realized it was already true. That's how people describe it when they finally connect with a direction that's genuinely theirs. Not a thunderbolt of clarity. Not a dramatic revelation. Just a quiet sense of, oh, this is what I actually care about. I've always cared about this. I just never let myself notice because I was too busy caring about what I was supposed to care about. This kind of motivation has different properties than its borrowed counterpart. First, it doesn't exhaust you. Borrowed motivation drains. It's fueled by tension, and it costs energy to maintain. Essential motivation sustains. You can engage with it for hours and feel more energized at the end than at the beginning. Second, it doesn't require external validation. Borrowed motivation is hungry for applause. It needs to be seen. Essential motivation is strangely indifferent to whether anyone notices. You do it because not doing it feels like holding your breath. Third, it doesn't respond well to force. You can't make yourself feel essential motivation. You can't schedule it, or optimize it, or turn it into a productivity system. It arises on its own timeline, in its own way, and trying to control it only makes it retreat. Fourth, it often doesn't make sense to others. Borrowed motivation is legible. It follows recognizable paths, career advancement, status markers, socially approved milestones. Essential motivation can look strange from the outside. It might lead you towards something that doesn't seem worth it by conventional measures. And that's precisely how you know it's real. But here's the most important thing to understand about essential motivation. It can only emerge in the space created by the dissolution of borrowed motivation. You cannot add it to a life already full of shoulds and performances. It requires emptiness. It requires silence. It requires the willingness to not know what you want long enough for what you actually want to make itself known. This is why the phase you're in matters so much. It's not just a difficult period to endure. It's the necessary condition for something genuine to arise. If you fill the silence too quickly with new goals, new distractions, new borrowed reasons to move, you'll miss what the silence was trying to make room for. And when it does arise, when essential motivation finally makes itself felt, it won't announce itself with trumpets. It will feel more like remembering something you'd forgotten you knew. A direction that was always there, underneath all the noise, waiting for the noise to stop so you could finally hear it. Part 8. The art of remaining. So what do you actually do while you're waiting for this new motivation to emerge? This is the question that creates the most anxiety. Because do is the only verb we've been taught to trust. Be feels like a failure. Wait feels like a waste. Remain feels like giving up. But what if the most active thing you can do right now is precisely nothing? Not passive nothing. Not resigned nothing, but a deliberate, conscious, chosen nothing. A nothing that says, I will not fill this space with borrowed reasons. I will not rush back into motion just to escape the discomfort of stillness. I will remain here, in this uncertainty, until something genuine makes itself known. This is not easy. It goes against every instinct you've developed over a lifetime of being rewarded for productivity and punished for pause. But it is the only way through. Here are the only practices that matter in this phase. And notice that none of them involve getting your motivation back. First, notice without fixing. When the emptiness feels heavy, don't try to solve it. Just observe it. What does emptiness actually feel like in your body? Where is it located? What texture does it have? Treat it as a phenomenon to be understood rather than a problem to be eliminated. Second, follow small curiosities without demanding they become goals. If something catches your attention, a book, a walk, a conversation, a random interest, follow it. Not because it will lead somewhere, just because it's alive for you in this moment. Essential motivation often announces itself first as small curiosity, easily dismissed because it doesn't look important. Third, rest without guilt. Your nervous system has been in overdrive for years. It needs recovery time that your conscious mind will never grant voluntarily. Let yourself rest, not as a strategy, not so you can be more productive later, just because rest is what's needed now. Fourth, speak honestly to someone safe, not to get advice, not to be fixed, just to be witnessed. I don't know what I want right now. I don't know who I am without my old goals. I'm scared that nothing will ever matter again. Saying these things out loud to someone who won't try to solve you releases a pressure that words can't describe. Fifth, trust the intelligence of your own psyche. This is the hardest one, because it requires faith in something you can't see or measure. But consider this. Every previous version of you eventually gave way to a new version. Every period of confusion eventually resolved into a new clarity. The pattern holds. The psyche knows how to do this. Your job isn't to direct the process. Your job is to stop interfering. And here's what begins to happen when you do these things. When you stop fighting the silence and start cooperating with it, the heaviness starts to lift. Not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually, imperceptibly, the quality of the emptiness changes. It becomes less like a void and more like a space, less like absence and more like potential, less like something's wrong and more like something's waiting. You start to notice things you couldn't notice when you were running. The way light falls through a window at a certain hour, the pull toward a conversation you would have avoided before, the quiet interest in a subject you've never had time to explore. These are not distractions from the important work of getting your life back on track. These are the first signals of the life that wants to live through you now. And one day, probably not the day you expect, probably not in the way you imagined, you'll realize something has shifted. You're moving again. Not because you forced yourself to move. Not because you found a new borrowed reason. But because movement became the natural expression of something alive inside you. You're not pushing. You're being pulled. And the direction, even if you can't fully explain it, feels true in a way the old directions never did. Part 9. The return. There is an old pattern that appears in stories from every culture and every era. A person leaves their ordinary world. They descend into darkness, confusion, or silence. They remain there for a time that cannot be rushed. And then they return, not as the same person who left, but as someone who carries something the ordinary world has forgotten. This is not just story structure. This is psychological structure. It's the map of genuine transformation. And you are somewhere on this map right now. The question isn't whether you'll emerge from this phase. The question is whether you'll emerge having actually completed the transformation, or having abandoned it halfway because the silence was too uncomfortable. Most people abandon it, not because they're weak, not because they're incapable, but because no one told them what was actually happening. No one told them that the loss of motivation was not a loss but a clearing. No one told them that the heaviness was not depression but reorganization. No one told them that the silence was not empty but full of the next version of themselves, waiting for enough quiet to become audible. They were told to push through, to stay productive, to not waste this time. And so they rushed back into motion, grabbed new borrowed goals, rebuilt the persona, and missed what the silence was trying to give them. You don't have to. You can remain. You can trust. You can let this phase do what it's trying to do, without forcing it to conform to a timeline that was never designed for genuine transformation. And here's what you might discover on the other side. The old motivations don't return. They were never meant to. They served their purpose and then dissolved. The way scaffolding serves its purpose, and then is removed to reveal the building that was forming behind it all along. What emerges instead is something simpler, quieter, less impressive to others perhaps, but infinitely more sustaining. You find yourself drawn toward things not because you should want them, but because you actually do. You find yourself moving not from pressure but from presence. You find yourself alive in a way that doesn't require constant effort to maintain. This is not a destination. It's not a permanent state. The psyche will continue to cycle through phases of clarity and confusion, movement and stillness, the whole range of human experience. But you'll move through these cycles differently now. You'll recognize the silences for what they are. You'll know that emptiness is not absence but preparation. And you'll trust the intelligence that knows how to transform you even when you don't understand what's happening. The silence you're in right now is not your enemy. It's not a sign that something's wrong with you. It's not evidence that you've lost your way. It's the sound of everything that isn't yours falling away, so that what is yours can finally be heard. And perhaps that's the only thing you needed to understand all along. You haven't lost your motivation. You've just stopped being motivated by things that were never really yours. And in that clearing, that vast, frightening, beautiful clearing, something genuine is already beginning to stir.